My name is Hazel, 35 years old, and 16 years ago my stepfather threw me out of his house into the freezing snow. You are not my blood, he said, slamming the door. He was telling the terrifying truth. At 35, completely broke and desperate, I walked into a government office to apply for Medicaid. The clerk typed my social security number into the system, and her face went completely white. This identity record is tied to an Interpol-linked federal missing child alert from 1991, she whispered. It belongs to a child who was kidnapped. When the federal agents arrived, they looked at my face and said a single word that shattered my entire reality. Kensington. Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight to discover who you truly are. The fluorescent lights of the Medicaid office buzzed overhead with a relentless, maddening hum. I sat in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, clutching a folder of rejection letters and overdue utility bills. I was 35 years old, and my life had hit an absolute dead end. For the past decade, I had built a highly specialized career as an archival document restoration specialist. I spent my days in climate-controlled vaults, carefully preserving historical manuscripts and verifying the authenticity of centuries-old paper. But when the State Museum lost its federal funding, my department was the first to be eliminated. My specialized skills did not translate well to the current job market. My savings had evaporated over the last 4 months of desperate searching, leaving me with exactly $18 in my checking account and an eviction notice taped to my apartment door. I approached window number 4 when my number was called. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Higgins, asked for my identification and my social security card. I slid them under the scratched plexiglass divider. She began typing the 9 digits into her archaic computer system. I watched her eyes behind her thick glasses. First, they narrowed in confusion. She typed the numbers a second time, her keystrokes louder and more deliberate. Then all the color drained from her face. Her hands began to tremble on the keyboard. She did not say a word to me. She simply stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, and hurried toward the back office. 5 agonizing minutes passed. The waiting room was filled with the sounds of crying children and frustrated applicants, but a strange, heavy silence seemed to isolate my window. The door to the back office finally swung open. The facility manager, a man named David, whom I recognized from previous visits, walked out. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, both wearing impeccably tailored dark suits and expressions carved from stone. Federal agents. I could spot government issue from a mile away. They walked directly to my chair. The taller agent reached into his jacket and produced a badge identifying himself as Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He asked me to stand up and place my hands behind my back. I was too stunned to fight. I was a quiet, law-abiding citizen who spent her life repairing torn paper. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs snapped around my wrists, the sharp click echoing in the crowded waiting room. Everyone stared at me. Mothers pulled their children closer. As the steel bit into my skin, my mind violently pulled me back to another moment of absolute helplessness. I was 19 years old. It was the middle of a brutal winter storm. The biting wind whipped snow across the driveway of the house I grew up in. Richard, the man I called my father, stood on the porch with a look of absolute disgust on his face. He held my cheap plastic suitcase by the handle and hurled it down the concrete steps. It hit the icy pavement and burst open, scattering my modest clothes and my few art supplies across the freezing slush. I had simply asked for a small portion of my college tuition to be covered, a fraction of what they were currently spending to buy my younger sister Brittany a brand new luxury car. Richard marched down the steps, grabbed me by the collar of my jacket, and shoved me toward the street. "You are not my blood," he spat, his face inches from mine. "You are nothing but a burden I tolerated. Get out of my sight!" I looked past him toward the front door. Patricia, the woman who had raised me, stood in the warm glow of the entryway. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She did not say a word. She simply turned her head away, her silence a profound act of betrayal. Through the large living room window, I could see Brittany sitting by the roaring fireplace, holding a mug of hot chocolate and smiling smugly at my expulsion. They left me in the snow with nothing. The harsh voice of Agent Miller pulled me back to the present. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and guided me out of the Medicaid office. We walked through the sliding glass doors and out into the glaring sunlight where a black government SUV was waiting at the curb. As they pushed me into the back seat, Agent Miller looked at his partner and muttered a single word that meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. Kensington. The drive to the FBI field office was executed in complete silence. My mind raced through every possible scenario. I had never committed a crime, never stolen a dime, never even received a speeding ticket. Yet here I was, secured in the back of a federal vehicle, being transported like a high-profile criminal. We arrived at a massive gray concrete building, heavily fortified with concrete barriers and security gates. They escorted me through a maze of sterile corridors until we reached an interrogation room. It was exactly like the ones in the movies, featuring a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 rigid chairs, and a large mirror occupying one entire wall. Agent Miller removed my handcuffs, gesturing for me to sit. He left the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts for nearly 20 minutes. When the door finally opened again, Agent Miller returned with a thick manila folder. He sat across from me and opened the file. He did not accuse me of welfare fraud. He did not ask about my bank accounts. Instead, he slid a piece of paper across the metal table. It was a photocopy of my birth certificate, the same document I had used my entire life to enroll in school, get my driver's license, and apply for jobs. "Take a good look at that, Hazel," Agent Miller said, his voice dangerously calm. My professional training immediately kicked in. I was a document restoration specialist. I spent my life analyzing the structural integrity of historical records. I looked at the photocopy, focusing on the typography and the standard formatting of the state seal. Even through a copy, the spacing of the letters and the alignment of the date stamps looked slightly irregular. The font kerning on the hospital name was anachronistic for the supposed year of my birth. "This is a forgery," I said quietly, my professional assessment overriding my panic. "The typesetting is inconsistent with official state documents from that decade." Agent Miller leaned back in his chair, a look of genuine surprise crossing his features. He exchanged a glance with the mirror on the wall, clearly communicating with whoever was watching us. "You have a sharp eye," he said. "You are entirely correct. It is a highly sophisticated forgery created over 3 decades ago. But that is not the most disturbing part. The Social Security number you provided to the Medicaid office, the number you have used since childhood, was flagged by our system because it belongs to an infant girl who died of a respiratory illness in a Texas hospital in 1990. You have been living under the stolen identity of a dead child for 35 years. The room started to spin. My breathing grew shallow. If my Social Security number was stolen, if my birth certificate was a complete fabrication, then who was I? Everything Richard and Patricia had ever told me was a lie. The lack of baby pictures, the missing hospital records, the complete absence of any extended family history on my side, it all suddenly made a horrifying, twisted kind of sense. Agent Miller reached into the folder and pulled out a digital tablet. He woke the screen and placed it in front of me. On the left side of the screen was a photograph of a baby girl, perhaps a year old, wearing a lavish silk dress. On the right side of the screen was a computer-generated image, an age progression model, showing what that baby would look like at 35 years old. I stared at the screen and felt the air leave my lungs. The woman in the digital rendering had my exact jawline, my distinct almond-shaped eyes, and the very specific slight arch of my left eyebrow. It was like looking into a mirror. Our facial recognition software matched your driver's license photo to this age progression model with a 98% certainty, Agent Miller explained softly. In 1991, the sole heir to the Kensington media empire was kidnapped from her crib in the middle of the night. It was one of the largest, most publicized manhunts in American history. An Interpol-linked missing child alert has remained active for 35 years. We believe you are that missing child. I closed my eyes, trying to stop the room from tilting. The Kensington media empire. Everyone in America knew that name. They owned television networks, international news conglomerates, and publishing houses. They were billionaires. And according to the federal government, I was their stolen daughter. The pieces of my brutal childhood fell into place with devastating clarity. I was not Richard and Patricia's biological child. I was never a daughter to them. I was a hostage. I was a human shield they had hidden in plain sight, using me to clean their house and serve their real biological child, Brittany. They had stolen my life, erased my true identity, and then discarded me the moment I became a financial inconvenience to them. "We need to confirm this officially," Agent Miller said, pulling a sterile plastic package from his jacket pocket. "We need an expedited DNA swab." I nodded numbly, opening my mouth. He ran the long cotton swab along the inside of my cheek, sealed it in a plastic tube, and handed it to a technician who had just stepped into the room. "We placed a rush order with the Federal Crime Lab," he told me. "We will have the preliminary results in 2 hours." Those 2 hours were the longest of my life. I sat alone in the cold interrogation room, staring at the blank metal table. My mind systematically dismantled every memory I had of my childhood. The way Patricia would fiercely guard my medical records whenever we went to a new clinic. The way Richard refused to let me apply for a passport when my high school class planned a trip to Europe. They were not strict, overbearing parents. They were criminals, terrified of being caught. They had forced me to live in the shadows, constantly making me feel inadequate and ugly, breaking my self-esteem so I would never have the courage to question my origins or seek a life beyond their control. The heavy metal door finally clicked open. Agent Miller walked in, but his entire demeanor had changed. The rigid, suspicious posture of an interrogator was gone. He looked at me with a profound mixture of respect and solemnity. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand. "The DNA is a definitive match," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "There is absolutely no margin of error. Your real name is Hazel Kensington." The shock hit me in physical waves. The life of a struggling, discarded, unemployed document specialist was over. My reality had been entirely rewritten by a single sheet of lab results. Agent Miller left the door propped open. The atmosphere in the hallway outside had transformed completely. Agents were moving rapidly, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Someone brought me a cup of premium coffee, apologizing for the wait. The handcuffs and the harsh questioning felt like a lifetime ago. I was no longer a suspect. I was the recovered center of a multi-billion-dollar dynasty. Activity in the hallway changed without warning. An agent opened the door and announced that Harrison Kensington's private helicopter had landed at a secured municipal helipad nearby. A motorcade was already entering the federal garage. Heavy footsteps soon echoed down the corridor, moving toward the interrogation room with urgent, unstoppable momentum. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, moving with an urgent, unstoppable momentum. The doorway darkened as a man stepped into the room. He was 65 years old, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that screamed absolute authority. His silver hair was swept back, and his face bore the distinguished, weathered lines of a man who had carried an unimaginable burden for decades. Harrison Kensington, one of the most powerful men in the country. He stopped just inside the room. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. He did not rush forward to embrace me. He did not break down into theatrical weeping sobs. He simply stood there, his piercing eyes scanning my face with a desperate, starving intensity. I watched as the professional armor of a ruthless CEO melted away, revealing the raw, bleeding heart of a father who had spent 35 years hunting for his stolen child. He looked at my jawline, my eyes, the shape of my brow. I saw his throat swallow hard as he recognized the undeniable features of his late wife living and breathing right in front of him. "Hazel," he whispered. The sound of my true name spoken by my true father vibrated with a power that commanded the entire room. At that exact second, the cheap, cracked smartphone sitting in my purse on the metal table began to vibrate violently. The federal agents had returned my belongings after confirming my identity. The screen lit up with a barrage of incoming messages. The news of the FBI activity had clearly leaked to the local networks faster than anyone anticipated. I pulled the phone from my bag and looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed a name that made my blood run instantly cold. Brittany. The golden child, the spoiled, arrogant sister who had not bothered to check on me, call me, or text me a single time in the 16 years since I was thrown into the snow. I opened the message preview. "Where are you? Why is the FBI searching our house? Mom and Dad are being questioned and reporters are outside. Call me immediately. Tell them this is a mistake before you destroy all of us." I stared at the frantic words on the glowing screen. For my entire life, Brittany had treated me like a peasant, a background character meant only to highlight her perfection. She had sat in the warmth of the living room, drinking hot chocolate, while I was banished to the freezing streets. Now her perfect, privileged world was catching fire, and she was terrified. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to explain or comfort her. I looked up from the cracked screen of my phone and met the powerful, steady gaze of Harrison Kensington. The man who possessed the wealth and resources to crush the people who had stolen my life. I calmly pressed the power button on my phone, locking the screen and plunging Brittany's frantic messages into darkness. I slid the useless piece of plastic across the metal table, pushing my past away forever. I stood up, straightening my shoulders, ready to step into my true legacy. Harrison Kensington did not say another word. He placed a firm, reassuring hand on my upper back and guided me out of the interrogation room. The federal agents parted as we moved through the corridor, no longer treating me as a suspect, but as the recovered victim at the center of a case. A private elevator carried us into the secured garage, where an armored vehicle waited with its engine running. The short motorcade drove us to the municipal helipad nearby. Minutes later, I stepped into the leather interior of Harrison's helicopter, leaving behind the terrified, impoverished woman I had been that morning. The flight over the city was a blur of towering skyscrapers and winding highways. Within 20 minutes, the dense urban landscape gave way to sprawling, manicured greenery. We descended toward a massive compound, protected by high iron gates and dense forests. The Kensington estate was not just a home. It was a fortress of unimaginable wealth. As the helicopter touched down on a private landing pad, a fleet of staff members stood waiting at a respectful distance. Harrison stepped out first and offered me his hand. "Welcome home, Hazel," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the decades of grief and relentless searching buried in that single phrase. I walked through the towering oak double doors of the main house. The foyer alone was larger than any apartment I had ever rented. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over imported marble floors. There were no raised voices, no subtle insults, no walking on eggshells to avoid triggering a violent outburst. There was only quiet efficiency and absolute security. Harrison introduced me to the head of his legal team and his chief of security, both of whom were already mobilizing to protect me from the impending media storm. He told them I was the sole priority. He did not smother me with dramatic hugs or overwhelming demands for affection. He recognized the shock I was processing and gave me the space I needed, directing a staff member to lead me to the private wing of the estate. The suite they brought me to took my breath away. It was a sprawling expanse of soft, neutral tones, featuring a king-sized bed, a private balcony overlooking the ocean, and a sitting area with a massive flat-screen television. I stood in the center of the room, looking at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I was wearing the cheap faded blazer I had put on for my Medicaid appointment. I looked completely out of place in this palace, yet this was the life that belonged to me from the moment I took my first breath. I picked up the remote control from the glass coffee table and turned on the television. I did not need to search for the right channel. Every major news network was broadcasting the exact same breaking story. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, in bold, glaring letters, "Kensington heir found alive after 35 years." The camera angle shifted from the studio anchors to a live feed on the ground. I felt my jaw clench. The broadcast was streaming directly from the front lawn of the suburban house where I had endured 2 decades of psychological torment. Richard and Patricia had wasted absolutely no time. They had arranged a cluster of microphones on their front porch, ensuring the cameras captured the carefully trimmed hedges and the picturesque facade of their home. They were orchestrating a masterclass in public manipulation. Richard stood at the microphones first. He had intentionally worn a faded, slightly wrinkled, button-down shirt, completely abandoning his usual country club attire to project the image of a humble, hard-working, blue-collar man. He looked straight into the cameras, his expression pulled into a mask of deep, agonizing sorrow. "We are just simple, honest people," Richard began, his voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. 35 years ago, on a freezing rainy night, a desperate homeless drifter knocked on our door. She shoved a screaming baby into my arms and ran into the darkness. We had no money. We barely had enough food for ourselves. But we looked at that innocent child, and we knew we could not let her freeze. We took Hazel in. We gave her our home, our name, and every ounce of love in our hearts. I stared at the screen, my expression turning to ice. A drifter. They were actually going to stand on national television and claim they were Good Samaritans. They were erasing the kidnapping, erasing the federal alert, and framing themselves as the ultimate saviors. Patricia stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. She was holding a tissue, dabbing at the corners of her dry eyes. She had specifically chosen to wear no makeup, her hair pulled back, simply to look fragile and defeated. "We sacrificed everything to give Hazel a good life," Patricia said, letting a strategic sob break her sentence. "We worked extra shifts. We treated her exactly like our own biological daughter. We protected her. And how does she repay us? Today, armed federal agents kicked down our door, terrifying our family. Hazel did not even call us to say goodbye. She found out she was the heir to a billionaire empire, and she discarded us like trash. She threw away the family who loved her the second she saw a dollar sign." The news cameras zoomed in on Patricia's face as she continued her theatrical performance. "My heart is broken," she wept, looking directly into the lens. "We gave you everything, Hazel. We gave you a family when nobody else wanted you. And now you send the FBI to harass the people who kept you alive? We are devastated by your greed." The broadcast cut back to the news anchors, who immediately began discussing the tragic plight of the adoptive parents who had their hearts broken by an ungrateful, newly wealthy daughter. I did not throw anything at the screen. I did not scream or cry. My professional training as a document restorer had taught me to identify forgeries by looking for the tiny, overlooked details. I analyzed their broadcast with the exact same clinical precision. Patricia claimed they were poor, struggling victims, yet she had forgotten to remove her diamond stud earrings, which caught the glare of the camera lights. Richard claimed they sacrificed everything for me, yet I clearly remembered him locking the refrigerator with a padlock when I was a teenager to ensure I did not eat the expensive groceries reserved for his biological daughter. They were spinning a magnificent lie, banking on the American public's tendency to sympathize with the working class over a billionaire dynasty. The door to my suite opened softly. Harrison stepped inside, glancing at the television screen. His jaw tightened in immediate fury as he listened to Patricia's concluding remarks. "Say the word," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. "I have the best media crisis team in the country standing by in the dining room. I will have my lawyers issue a gag order. I will shut down every network broadcasting their faces within the hour. We will silence them completely." I turned away from the television and looked at my biological father. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. "Do not issue a gag order. Do not shut them down." Harrison frowned, clearly confused by my restraint. "They are defaming you on national television, Hazel. They are painting you as the villain." "Let them talk," I said, crossing my arms as I looked back at the frozen frame of Richard and Patricia on the screen. "The louder they speak, the more confident they will become, and the more confident they become, the more evidence they will create. They think they can manipulate the media to force me into a settlement or a public apology. They think I am still the terrified 19-year-old girl they threw into the snow." I picked up the remote and muted the television. "They want to play the victims in front of the whole world," I continued, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly can, because when I finally push them in, I want to make sure they can never climb out." The media circus did not end with Richard and Patricia standing on their suburban front porch. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the narrative had escalated from a local human interest story to a national spectacle. I sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table in the Kensington Estate crisis room, a cup of black coffee in my hand. The walls were lined with digital monitors, tracking every major news network, social media platform, and financial outlet in the country. Harrison sat to my right, flanked by his senior public relations executives and elite crisis management lawyers. We were all watching the center monitor, which was tuned to the highest-rated morning talk show in America. The network had promoted an exclusive live interview with the sister of the recovered Kensington heir. Brittany had secured the primetime slot. She sat on the plush studio sofa dressed impeccably in a soft beige cashmere sweater and modest pearls. She looked exactly like the polished, affluent, perfectly innocent woman she had always pretended to be. Her blonde hair was styled to look effortlessly neat, and she held a crumpled tissue in her hands, squeezing it nervously. The studio audience sat in absolute silence, hanging on to her every word. The host leaned forward, projecting profound sympathy. Brittany, the host, began her voice soft and inviting. "The entire country is reeling from this news. You grew up sharing a home with Hazel. You called her your sister. How is your family coping with the sudden arrival of federal agents and the revelation that she is a billionaire heiress?" Brittany took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked down at her hands, letting a single, perfectly timed tear escape. "We are completely shattered," Brittany said, her voice catching flawlessly. "My parents are elderly, hard-working people. They dedicated their entire lives to giving Hazel a normal, loving home. But the truth is, living with Hazel was never easy. She was always a deeply troubled child. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my expression completely unchanged. The legal team around me shifted uncomfortably, but I raised a hand, signaling them to stay silent and listen. "What do you mean by troubled?" the host prompted, eager for the drama. Brittany wiped her cheek. She was intensely jealous. No matter what my parents did for her, it was never enough. They poured their life savings into her. They paid for private tutors because she struggled in school. They paid out of pocket for expensive psychiatric care and behavioral therapy because she had violent outbursts. They went into massive credit card debt to buy her clothes, fix her teeth, and try to make her feel beautiful and accepted. But Hazel resented us. She resented me because I was biologically theirs. She punished my parents for loving her. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Private tutors, psychiatric care, credit card debt. Brittany was sitting on national television fabricating a financial history that had never existed. I remembered scrubbing the grout in her bathroom with a toothbrush while she took private piano lessons. I remembered wearing her discarded stained sweaters to high school while she drove to campus in a luxury sedan. "And then she abandoned you?" the host asked, shaking her head in dismay. "Yes," Brittany choked out, looking directly into the camera lens. "When she was 19, she simply packed a bag and walked out. She stole money from my parents' retirement fund and vanished. We begged her to stay. My father stood in the snow crying, pleading with her to come back inside. But she walked away without looking back. And now, 16 years later, we find out she is a Kensington. She used our family, drained our resources, and now she refuses to even answer my text messages." The studio audience murmured in sympathetic outrage. The narrative was taking hold perfectly. Brittany was weaponizing the classic American class divide. She was painting me as the greedy, ungrateful elite who had exploited a hard-working blue-collar family and then tossed them aside. The host placed a comforting hand on Brittany's knee. "Your family must be facing incredible hardship now, especially with the unwanted media attention and the legal fees from the FBI investigation. What is it that you want from Hazel? What is the resolution here?" This was the moment. This was the exact pivot I had been waiting for. Brittany straightened her posture, looking resolute, brave, and deeply wronged. "We do not want to ruin her new life," Brittany said firmly. "We just want to be made whole. My parents sacrificed their financial security to keep her off the streets. They mortgaged their house to pay for her specialized care. We had an independent financial auditor review the costs of raising a child with Hazel's specific severe behavioral needs over the course of nearly 2 decades, factoring in the inflation, the stolen retirement funds, and the severe emotional distress she has caused my parents in their twilight years." Brittany paused, making sure every viewer across the country was listening. "We are formally requesting $10 million, she announced. "It is a drop in the bucket for the Kensington Empire, but for my parents, it is the exact cost of what they lost trying to save a child who never loved them back. If Hazel has any shred of a conscience, she will reimburse the family that kept her alive." The broadcast cut to a commercial break. The crisis room erupted into chaos. Harrison slammed his fist down on the mahogany table, the heavy thud silencing the room. "This is textbook extortion," he roared, glaring at his lead attorney. "They are attempting to hold her public image hostage. They know the public will side with the adopted family. They want us to cut a check just to make the media nightmare disappear." The lead public relations executive looked pale. "Mr. Kensington, the internet is already reacting. The hashtags are trending against Hazel. People are calling her an ungrateful billionaire. They are starting GoFundMe pages for Richard and Patricia. If we do not handle this delicately, the public backlash could impact the Kensington corporate stock by the opening bell tomorrow. We might need to consider a quiet, undisclosed settlement just to kill the story." "Absolutely not." The entire room froze and turned to look at me. I placed my coffee cup down on the saucer. The porcelain clinked sharply in the tense silence. I stood up from the table, straightening my jacket. I walked toward the wall of monitors, my eyes scanning the live feeds of social media outrage. Brittany had played her hand exactly as I expected. She was greedy, arrogant, and entirely blinded by her own ego. She had assumed that because I was now surrounded by billionaires and corporate lawyers, I would act like them. She assumed I would throw money at a problem to make it go away. Hazel Harrison said softly, stepping up beside me. We can crush them in court, but it will take years. The court of public opinion moves in minutes. I turned to look at my father, offering him a calm, razor-sharp smile. The court of public opinion only works when the lies cannot be immediately disproven, I said. I walked back to the table and looked at the lead attorney. Did you hear exactly what Brittany claimed on live television? I asked. She demanded $10 million for raising you, the attorney replied, looking confused. No, I corrected him, tapping my finger against the polished wood. She claimed my adoptive parents paid out of pocket for expensive psychiatric care, specialized behavioral therapy, and private medical treatments. She claimed they mortgaged their house to pay my medical bills. The attorney nodded slowly. Yes, that was her justification for the $10 million demand. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, precise whisper. Yesterday, the FBI arrested me at a government office because I was applying for Medicaid. I've been on state-subsidized healthcare for my entire adult life, and before I turned 18, Richard and Patricia enrolled me in the state's low-income children's health insurance program. They never paid a single dime out of pocket for any medical care I received. The room fell dead silent. The lead attorney's eyes widened as the legal implications of my words finally clicked into place. If they enrolled you in state-subsidized healthcare while hiding the $2 million ransom they stole, the attorney breathed out, his voice practically shaking with realization. Exactly, I said, standing tall. Brittany just went on national television and provided a detailed, itemized list of fraudulent expenses to justify a $10 million extortion demand. She just publicly confessed to decades of welfare fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. I looked at the public relations executive who was suddenly furiously typing on his tablet. Cancel the quiet settlement, I ordered, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Do not issue a single denial. Book the largest press conference venue in the city for noon today. Invite every network that just broadcast Brittany's interview. They want to use the media to force me into a corner. I am going to use the media to lock them in a federal prison. The legal team immediately erupted into overlapping protests. A senior partner with a heavily lined face stepped forward, warning that an unscripted press conference was a catastrophic risk. He insisted that paying the $10 million from a hidden shell company would make the problem vanish by sunset. Harrison raised a single hand, and the room instantly fell silent. He looked at me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he turned back to his team. You heard my daughter, Harrison said. His tone, leaving no room for debate. Secure the venue. We arrived at the downtown convention center exactly at noon. The grand ballroom was packed, wall to wall, with journalists, camera crews, and reporters from every major syndicate. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. They expected a tearful, overwhelmed young woman begging for privacy, or perhaps a defensive heiress trying to buy her way out of a scandal. I was going to give them neither. I walked onto the stage. I was no longer wearing the faded blazer from the government office. Harrison's styling team had provided a sharply tailored midnight blue suit that fit like armor. I stepped up to the podium. The chaotic roar of shouted questions and camera flashes washed over me, but my heart beat with a slow, mechanical rhythm. I did not flinch. I did not smile. I simply tapped the microphone once, and the heavy thud echoed through the massive ballroom, forcing the crowd into an expectant silence. This morning, The woman I was raised to call my sister appeared on national television. I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear. Brittany claimed that I was a violent, disturbed child. She claimed that my adoptive parents, Richard and Patricia, bankrupted themselves paying for my specialized medical care. She also claimed that 16 years ago, I stole their retirement savings and vanished into the night, while my father wept in the snow, begging me to stay. I looked directly into the bank of television cameras. I am a document restoration specialist. My entire career is built on verifying primary sources and exposing forgeries. I do not deal in emotional narratives. I deal in evidence. So rather than trading insults with Brittany, I will simply provide the primary source regarding my departure. I pressed a button on the podium console. The massive digital screen behind me flickered to life. Harrison's investigators had proven their worth overnight. Richard was a deeply paranoid man who obsessed over protecting his property. In the late 90s, he installed a closed-circuit surveillance system around the house, and later upgraded it through the same security vendor. Because he refused to pay the archival deletion fee, the vendor preserved the legacy data during its cloud migration. Harrison's attorneys obtained an emergency preservation order and subpoena through the pending federal investigation. Once the vendor produced the encrypted archive, the cyber team recovered the footage in less than 3 hours. The video began to play. There was no audio, but the harsh, grainy black and white footage spoke louder than any words could. The timestamp in the bottom right corner clearly displayed a date from 16 years ago in the dead of winter. The journalists in the room stopped typing. The frantic clicking of cameras completely ceased. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. On the massive screen, the front door of Richard and Patricia's suburban home flew open. A 19-year-old version of myself was violently shoved out onto the freezing concrete. The wind was visibly whipping the snow into a frenzy. Richard stormed out onto the porch, his face contorted in rage. He was not weeping. He was not begging me to stay. He hurled my cheap plastic suitcase down the steps with such brutal force that it shattered upon impact with the icy driveway. My meager belongings spilled into the frozen slush. The camera angle perfectly captured the front window of the house, inside illuminated by the warm glow of a roaring fireplace. Brittany was sitting on a plush sofa. She was holding a mug, laughing hysterically at the sight of me scrambling in the snow to gather my frozen clothes. Patricia stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching with absolute chilling apathy before stepping back inside and slamming the heavy oak door shut. I let the video loop twice in the dead silence of the ballroom. I wanted every reporter, every viewer at home, and every person who had ever doubted me to burn that image into their retinas. I pressed the button again, cutting the screen to black. The sudden darkness in the room felt heavy and suffocating. "As you can clearly see, there were no stolen retirement funds," I said, my voice slicing through the stunned quiet. There were no pleading parents. There was only a teenager thrown into sub-zero temperatures with absolutely nothing. That footage alone dismantles the emotional extortion presented this morning. I leaned closer to the microphone, gripping the edges of the podium. But we are not just dealing with a fabricated sob story. We are dealing with federal crimes. Brittany publicly demanded $10 million as reimbursement for my supposed psychiatric care and specialized medical treatments. She claimed Richard and Patricia mortgaged their home to keep me healthy. However, government records will show that from the time I was a toddler until the day I was thrown into that snowstorm, Richard and Patricia had me enrolled in the state's low-income children's health care program. They committed systematic welfare fraud for nearly 2 decades, claiming absolute poverty on paper while living in a luxury home. The ballroom erupted. Reporters were shouting over one another, frantically speaking into their headsets, realizing they were breaking a massive federal fraud scandal live on air. The narrative had not just shifted, it had completely inverted. I was no longer the ungrateful billionaire heiress. I was the victim of a calculated, decades-long criminal enterprise, and I had just handed the media the smoking gun. My legal team is currently turning all of this evidence, along with the broadcast of Britney's fraudulent extortion demands, directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I concluded, my eyes locked on the primary broadcast camera. I will not pay a single cent of hush money to the people who stole my life. I will see them in federal court. I stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage. I did not look back. The flashbulbs erupted behind me like a lightning storm, capturing the exact moment the fake, perfect world of my abusers began to burn to the ground. The ride back to the Kensington estate was charged with an electric, undeniable energy. Harrison sat across from me in the armored SUV, his phone continuously vibrating with updates from his legal team. The press conference had detonated exactly as planned. The public narrative had violently shifted, transforming me from a villain into a survivor, and painting my abusers into a corner they could never escape. But exposing their public lies was only the first phase of my strategy. Now it was time to completely dismantle their foundation. As soon as we walked through the towering oak doors of the compound, Harrison did not lead me to the dining hall to celebrate. He guided me down a secured corridor into the basement level of the estate. The heavy steel doors opened to reveal a massive, heavily air-conditioned command center. The walls were lined with glowing monitors displaying complex financial flowcharts, property records, and banking histories. Sitting at a large glass table were three of the most ruthless forensic accountants in the country. We are going to find out exactly how a struggling blue-collar family suddenly afforded a luxurious suburban mansion and an elite lifestyle, Harrison said, taking a seat at the head of the table. I sat beside him, folding my hands on the cool glass surface. The lead accountant, a sharp-featured man named Caldwell, brought a series of scanned documents onto the main presentation screen. He began laying out a timeline that would unravel the darkest secret Richard and Patricia had ever kept. Let us look at 1990. Caldwell began pointing a laser pointer at a dismal financial graph. Richard and Patricia were practically bankrupt. Richard had just been terminated from a security contracting firm. They had maxed out every credit card, missed 3 consecutive rent payments on a tiny apartment, and were facing absolute financial ruin. They had absolutely zero assets to their name. Caldwell clicked a button, and the screen transitioned to documents dated late 1991. This was months after my kidnapping, and nearly 5 years before Brittany's birth, when Richard and Patricia first converted ransom cash into permanent assets. Within 4 months, Richard deposited large amounts of cash into offshore accounts through newly registered shell companies, Caldwell explained. He purchased a suburban estate outright, bought luxury vehicles, and secured country club memberships. A protected reserve from the same funds later paid for Brittany's birth, private schooling, and the privileged childhood they claimed to have earned through honest work. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the staggering numbers. My professional background in analyzing historical documents allowed me to read the financial ledgers with absolute clarity. I saw the fraudulent transfers, the dummy corporations, and the aggressive money laundering tactics used to hide a massive, sudden influx of wealth. They had gone from absolute poverty to immense, untraceable riches overnight. I looked at Harrison. The lines on his face had deepened, and his eyes were blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. "How much did they deposit in total?" Harrison asked, his voice dangerously low. Caldwell pulled up the final ledger. "When we aggregate the shell company deposits, the property purchase, and the initial investment into Richard's so-called business ventures, the total influx of untraceable capital amounts to exactly $2 million. The air in the room vanished. The number hung in the sterile, air-conditioned space like a physical weight. $2 million. Harrison whispered, his hands clenching into fists on the glass table. I looked between my father and the accountant, the pieces of the puzzle aggressively locking into place. That was the ransom, I said, my voice steady despite the massive revelation. Harrison turned to me, his expression reflecting decades of agonizing heartbreak and rage. When you were taken from your crib, the kidnappers sent a single demand. They wanted exactly $2 million in unmarked, non-sequential bills. We followed their instructions perfectly. We dropped the money at the designated location, but the exchange was a setup. The kidnappers took the duffel bags of cash and vanished into the night. They never returned you. For 35 years, the FBI tracked serial numbers, searched offshore accounts, and hunted for that money. It simply disappeared. Until now, I replied, staring at the financial records on the screen. Because Richard did not just randomly find me. He was the one who took the money. He kept the ransom and he kept me to ensure there were no loose ends. My mind raced backward, analyzing my entire childhood under a horrifying new light. Every luxurious dress Brittany ever wore, every expensive private tutor she ever had, every single piece of her perfect, privileged life had been directly funded by the blood money stolen from my family. Richard and Patricia had literally built their golden child's future on the ransom paid from my life. While they locked the refrigerator and forced me to wear threadbare hand-me-downs, they were actively spending the millions of dollars my true father had paid to save me. I had spent my teenage years scrubbing the marble floors of a suburban mansion that was purchased entirely with the price tag put on my own head. Caldwell left the ransom ledger before opening the next investigative layer. For the moment, the financial trail was enough. He displayed a property map layered with purchase dates, shell company names, and serial number records preserved from the original ransom investigation. The original cash was divided before it ever reached a conventional bank, he said. Some of it purchased the house, some funded Richard's first logistics investments. The rest was converted into bearer instruments and later deposited through offshore companies. We cannot identify every bill after 35 years. But the timing amounts and transfer pattern are not coincidental. They form a continuous chain from the ransom drop to the assets Richard and Patricia control today. Harrison stood behind his chair, both hands pressed against the glass table. Is it enough to stop them from moving the money? It is enough for an emergency preservation order, Caldwell replied. The federal prosecutor submitted the tracing affidavit this morning. A judge signed it 10 minutes ago. He touched the keyboard. Red markers appeared across the property map. The first alert covered Richard and Patricia's primary checking accounts. The second locked their investment portfolio. The third placed a restraint on the suburban mansion, the vehicles, and the holding companies that paid their country club expenses. Each notification carried the same status: transactions suspended pending federal forfeiture review. I watched their stolen empire become immobile, one asset at a time. This does not transfer anything to us, Caldwell explained. It prevents sale, withdrawal, refinancing, or concealment while investigators establish final ownership. Richard cannot empty the accounts, Patricia cannot borrow against the house. Any attempt to move funds through a new entity will create an additional record for the prosecution and Brittany, I asked. Caldwell opened a second dashboard. Her name appeared beside a luxury apartment lease, a sports car contract, and 3 premium credit cards. None of them were funded by income she had earned. Richard's offshore companies paid every balance through a family trust created with the laundered ransom proceeds. Her allowance has been suspended, Caldwell said. The apartment manager and vehicle lender have been notified that the funding source is under federal restraint. They will follow their own contractual procedures, but she no longer has access to the accounts that kept her lifestyle functioning. For a moment, I pictured Brittany at a boutique counter, extending a platinum card with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. I imagined the decline message appearing, followed by the panic she had once enjoyed watching in me. The image brought no joy. It brought clarity. Their wealth had never been proof of superiority. It had been evidence. Harrison looked toward the screen showing the mansion. They built that house with the money meant to bring you home. And then they made me clean it, I said. The words landed harder than I expected. Harrison's face tightened, but he did not offer an apology. For years, he had not been allowed to share. He simply remained beside me, steady and present. Caldwell saved the court orders into the evidence archive. The financial strike is complete. They are frozen, but not yet finished. Money proves motive and benefit. It does not by itself prove who entered the Kensington estate, who removed the child, or why the child was kept alive under a false identity. I looked at the locked accounts glowing red across the monitors. Then show me the part that proves how they took me. Caldwell closed the financial ledger and opened a separate case file marked Security Access 1990-1991. The room became silent again. The ransom money had exposed the castle. The next file was going to identify the man who had built it. The security file did not begin with the kidnapping. It began 11 months earlier, with a termination report from a private contracting company that had serviced the Kensington estate. Caldwell enlarged the first page. Richard's employee photograph appeared in the upper corner, already carrying the hard expression I remembered from childhood. In 1990, Richard worked for North Atlantic Protective Systems, Caldwell said. The company had a temporary contract to upgrade cameras, perimeter alarms, and emergency power at the Kensington compound. His assignment gave him access to floor plans, staff schedules, maintenance corridors, and the programming sequence for the nursery wing. Harrison stared at the photograph. I remember the contractor. We dismissed several workers after equipment disappeared. Richard was one of them. The next document was an internal incident report. It accused Richard of copying restricted schematics entering a residential corridor outside his assigned hours and removing a box of electronic components from a secure storage room. The company terminated him, but chose not to prosecute because the components were recovered and the estate's management wanted the project completed without publicity. Richard had left the job with no savings, no future employment, and a map of the house where I slept. Caldwell opened the original access logs. One badge number appeared repeatedly beside the nursery service corridor. Richard had tested the door at different times over a 3-week period, recording how long security personnel took to respond to false alarms. He had not been repairing the system. He had been rehearsing. A second investigator placed a cardboard evidence box on the table. Inside were copies of records recovered from a storage facility rented under one of Richard's early aliases. The unit had been abandoned years ago, after automatic payments stopped, but the facility preserved its old inventory photographs for an insurance dispute. Harrison's legal team had obtained a warrant before opening the surviving sealed containers. The evidence was ordinary: a contractor's uniform, a duplicate service badge, a hand-drawn diagram of the Kensington nursery wing, a list of household employees and their weekly schedules, a newspaper clipping announcing Harrison's attendance at a media conference on the night I disappeared. And beneath those items, sealed inside a plastic sleeve, was a faded photograph of the rear service road behind the estate. I recognized the landscape without remembering it. Caldwell pointed to a handwritten note along the photograph's edge. Power interruption at 2:14. West camera resets in 90 seconds. Harrison's jaw tightened. That was the exact failure recorded the night she was taken. The kidnapping file described the outage as a malfunction. Richard knew the backup system because he had helped install it. He did not need to overpower guards or climb a wall. He entered wearing a contractor's jacket, triggered a failure he understood, and walked through a service corridor during the 90-second camera reset. Patricia's role emerged from a different set of records. At the time, she worked the overnight desk at a small motel near the interstate. On the night of the kidnapping, she altered the handwritten guest ledger and assigned an empty room to a false name. Telephone company records showed 3 calls from that room to a payphone near the Kensington estate, and another call to the number later used for the ransom demand. She gave him a place to hold you during the first stage, Caldwell said. She also provided access to guest registration forms, discarded identification copies, and travelers' personal information. That is likely how they learned to construct replacement records. I thought about the forged birth certificate Agent Miller had shown me. The stolen Social Security number had belonged to a child who died in Texas. Caldwell displayed a copy of an old hospital mailing list, sold illegally through an identity broker. The dead child's name and number were marked in Richard's handwriting. They had not improvised my identity after deciding to raise me. They had prepared it. The ransom exchange occurred 3 days after the kidnapping. Harrison followed every instruction. He placed $2 million in unmarked bills inside 2 canvas bags and left them beneath an abandoned railway platform. Federal agents monitored the area from a distance, but Richard anticipated surveillance. He sent a transient man to collect the bags in exchange for $500 and a promise of work. By the time agents detained the courier, Richard had taken the money through a drainage access point beneath the platform. The courier could not identify him. Richard wore a mask paid in cash and disappeared before the operation closed around the wrong man. What went wrong with returning me? I asked. Caldwell did not answer immediately. He opened a recovered memorandum written by one of the original investigators. The document described a second set of instructions that arrived after the ransom disappeared. The kidnappers demanded a clear route to another location, supposedly for the child's release. No child was found there. Only a blanket and an empty feeding bottle remained. Agent Miller, who had joined the meeting by secure video, spoke from the main screen. "We believe Richard intended to abandon you where you would be discovered," he said. But the ransom operation created more attention than he expected. Roadblocks went up across the region. Airports, bus stations, hospitals, and shelters received your photograph. A child found alone would have become the center of the investigation, and anyone connected to the location risked exposure. So they kept me because releasing me was more dangerous than hiding me, yes. The sentence settled over the room. Richard and Patricia moved twice during the next year. They avoided pediatricians who required complete records and used cash clinics when I became ill. Patricia told neighbors I was a niece whose mother had died. When questions became uncomfortable, they relocated again. By the time the national coverage faded, my hair had changed, my face had grown, and the forged identity was established well enough to pass routine school enrollment. 5 years later, Brittany was born. Caldwell brought up family photographs arranged by date. The first images showed me in oversized clothes, standing slightly apart from Richard and Patricia. After Brittany appeared, the pattern changed. I was positioned behind the stroller, beside the luggage, or at the edge of the frame holding supplies. Birthday photographs celebrated Brittany while I carried plates. Vacation records listed me as a dependent, but showed charges only for 3 airline tickets. On those trips, I had been left with neighbors and told the family could not afford to take me. They had kept me first as evidence they needed to conceal. Later, they used me as labor. Richard controlled me through fear. Patricia controlled me through guilt. They repeatedly told me that I had arrived unwanted, that they had saved me from abandonment, and that every meal created a debt I could never repay. When I asked about baby photographs, Patricia accused me of being ungrateful. When I wanted a passport, Richard became violent. When I applied to colleges outside Massachusetts, important documents disappeared. Their cruelty was not random. It was an identity security system. They made me feel too defective to investigate myself. Harrison turned away from the screens and walked several steps toward the dark glass wall. His reflection looked divided by the glowing lines of financial data. "I spent 35 years believing the kidnappers might have killed you," he said. "They were raising you 20 miles away." He already understood that raising was the wrong word. Caldwell opened one final digital folder. The label read, "Audio Recovery Ransom Call 03." The FBI preserved the original call on analog evidence tape, he explained. The recording deteriorated, and early enhancement attempts damaged portions of the signal. Our restoration laboratory has recovered most of the voice profile, but the final authentication process is not complete. A waveform appeared on the screen. Beneath the static, a male voice formed several broken syllables. Harrison closed his eyes. "That is him," he said. "We still need the laboratory certification before the recording can be used publicly or at trial," Agent Miller cautioned. "But the employment records, access logs, storage evidence, false identity documents, ransom tracing, and Patricia's motel records have changed the case. This is no longer a historical missing child inquiry. It is an active kidnapping and extortion conspiracy investigation." "Then arrest them," Harrison said. Agent Miller's expression remained controlled. "The prosecutor wants the case built to survive every challenge. The financial restraint prevents flight and concealment. Search warrants are being prepared for their house, devices, and remaining storage locations. We move when the warrants and charging affidavits are complete, not before." I understood the discipline behind the decision. Richard and Patricia had escaped justice for 35 years because they exploited gaps assumptions and incomplete records. Rushing now would give them another gap. I looked at Richard's old employee photograph on the screen. He had spent my entire childhood insisting I was worthless, yet every decision he made proved the opposite. He had reorganized his life around hiding who I was. He had forged a dead child's identity, manipulated schools and clinics, moved houses, monitored my documents, and destroyed my confidence because the truth of my name could destroy him. For the first time, I saw his hatred clearly. It had always been fear. Caldwell archived the security records and secured the physical evidence box. "The accounts are frozen," he said. "The kidnapping case is moving, and the audio restoration is nearly finished. They have lost control of the money and the public narrative." A notification flashed across the legal monitor before he could continue. An emergency civil filing had been entered under my name. Richard and Patricia had found one document they believed could still control my future. The financial war was no longer enough for them. They were taking the kidnapping into court. The freezing of their accounts was a tactical strike that should have paralyzed them entirely. But cornered animals are unpredictable, and Richard was a man who had spent his entire life building backup plans out of paranoia and greed. Within 48 hours of the federal asset forfeiture, my father's legal team received an emergency notification from the probate court. The transition of my legal identity and my integration into the Kensington Family Trust had been abruptly halted. A temporary injunction had been filed. Someone was claiming rightful ownership over my entire financial future. I sat in the command center of the estate as Caldwell, the lead forensic accountant, projected a scanned legal document onto the main screen. The paperwork was dated 17 years ago, stamped exactly 1 week after my 18th birthday. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold as I recognized my own handwriting on the final page. It was my signature, executed in faded blue ink. "What exactly is this?" Harrison asked, his voice sharp and dangerous. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, reading the dense legal jargon. "It is an irrevocable transfer of rights and future assets," Caldwell explained. "According to this document, Hazel voluntarily agreed to surrender any and all future earnings, inheritances, trust funds, and financial windfalls to Richard and Patricia. In exchange, the document states, they would provide her with financial backing for her college tuition." The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was 18 years old, sitting at the cheap kitchen table in their suburban house. I had just been accepted into a highly competitive university program for historical preservation and archival studies. I was desperate to escape their toxic household, but I had absolutely no money to pay the tuition deposit. Patricia had screamed at me for hours about how much of a financial burden I was. Then Richard walked in with a thick stack of stapled papers. He slammed them down on the table, claiming it was a student loan cosigner agreement. He told me that if I wanted to go to college, I had to sign the last page to prove I was legally responsible for the debt. They did not let me read the pages. Richard kept his heavy hand clamped over the top of the stack, revealing only the signature line at the very bottom. Terrified of losing my only chance at an education, I signed it. I signed away my entire life for a student loan they never even paid. A year later, they threw me into the snow, and I had to drop out anyway. They filed this injunction this morning, Caldwell continued, bringing up a separate legal filing. They are arguing that because Hazel signed this contract as a legal adult, any wealth she acquires now automatically belongs to them. They want the court to freeze the Kensington inheritance and redirect it into their accounts. Harrison slammed his fist onto the glass table. They kidnapped you, used you as a slave, and now they are trying to use a fraudulent contract to steal the empire I built. I will bury them alive. Before Harrison could mobilize his attorneys, my security detail reported that Brittany had arrived at Suffolk County Superior Court, where the emergency civil injunction had been assigned to the business litigation session. Richard and Patricia stayed away, on counsel's advice, fearing that another public appearance or spontaneous statement would strengthen the federal case against them. We took the armored SUV to the courthouse. The marble hallways of the federal building were swarming with reporters, all hungry for the next chapter of the Kensington saga. As we approached the designated hearing room, the crowd parted. Standing near the heavy wooden doors was Brittany. The past 2 days had clearly taken a toll on her. Her platinum credit cards had been declined. Her luxury apartment was likely facing imminent eviction due to the asset freeze. She was wearing a designer trench coat, but her hair was slightly unkempt, and she lacked her usual polished arrogance. She looked frantic, holding a leather briefcase tightly against her chest. When she saw me walking down the corridor, flanked by Harrison and a team of corporate lawyers, a spark of vicious triumph returned to her eyes. She marched straight toward us, ignoring the cameras flashing around us. "You really thought you could just cut us off," Brittany sneered, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "You thought you could lock our accounts and walk away with billions while we lose everything?" I stopped a few feet away from her, my expression completely impassive. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the fear she so desperately wanted to see. "You are holding a piece of paper that was obtained through fraud, Brittany," I said calmly. "Your parents tricked an 18-year-old girl into signing a document she was not allowed to read." Brittany laughed a harsh, grating sound. "It does not matter what they told you, Hazel. Your signature is on the dotted line. You were a legal adult. My parents hired a very smart, very expensive lawyer years ago to draft this. It is ironclad. You signed away your future to pay us back for keeping you alive, and now the court is going to enforce it." She pulled a copy of the contract from her briefcase and shoved it toward me. "The injunction is already active," she gloated, her eyes wide with greedy desperation. "You cannot touch a single cent of the Kensington fortune without my parents getting their cut. They own your financial future. But we are willing to be reasonable." I did not take the paper from her. I just stared at her, analyzing her erratic behavior. "Reasonable," I repeated flatly. "Yes," Brittany said, lowering her voice slightly so the reporters could not hear. "Drop the FBI investigation. Call off the asset forfeiture. Give my parents their house and their money back, and guarantee me a lifetime allowance of $50,000 a month. If you do that, we will tear up the contract. If you refuse, we will drag this out in probate court for the next decade. We will freeze your billions so tightly you will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without a judge's permission." Harrison stepped forward, his presence radiating intimidation. "You are extorting my daughter inside a state courthouse," he said. I will make certain the prosecutor receives every word of this threat. I held up my hand, stopping my father. I looked at the copy of the contract Brittany was clutching. I looked at the dark black ink of the printed text and the faded blue ink of my signature at the bottom of the page. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have been terrified by the prospect of losing a multi-billion-dollar empire to a fraudulent legal trap. But I was not a normal person. I was an archival document restoration specialist. I had spent 15 years of my life inside sterile laboratories using microscopes, chemical analysis, and ultraviolet light to authenticate historical manuscripts. I knew the anatomy of paper. I knew the exact chemical composition of printer toner. And looking at the document in Brittany's trembling hands, I saw something that made a cold, razor-sharp smile form on my lips. "You think you have me trapped?" I said, my voice completely devoid of fear. "You think this piece of paper is your golden ticket back to your luxury lifestyle? It is a legally binding contract," Brittany spat, pointing at the... "You cannot run from it." I took the copy from her hands. I ran my fingertips over the printed text of the asset relinquishment clauses, then down to the signature line. "I will see you in the hearing room, Brittany," I said, turning my back on her without another word. I walked into the courtroom with Harrison and my legal team. The opposing counsel, a sleazy lawyer Richard had likely promised a massive contingency fee, was already setting up his files. He looked incredibly smug, convinced he was about to hold a billionaire dynasty hostage with a single piece of paper. They believed they had executed the perfect counterattack. They believed they had effectively frozen my inheritance and forced me into a corner where I had no choice but to pay their ransom. They thought the signature of a terrified 18-year-old girl was an unbreakable chain. But as I sat down at the defendant's table and asked my lawyer to request the original document from the judge's clerk, I prepared to do what I did best. I was going to dissect their perfect forgery layer by layer, and I was going to use my professional expertise to turn their ultimate weapon into the very evidence that would lock them away for the rest of their lives. The heavy wooden gavel cracked against the sounding block, echoing through the Suffolk County courtroom. Judge Eleanor Mitchell, a Superior Court judge known for strict adherence to contract law and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the emergency civil hearing to order. The gallery was packed with journalists who had slipped past the security perimeter, all waiting to see whether the newly recovered Kensington heir would lose control of her inheritance to a document bearing a signature made 17 years earlier. Court officers closed the doors, and the room settled into a tense silence. Attorney Gibson, the lawyer hired by Richard and Patricia, stood up from his table. He was a slick, theatrical man who specialized in aggressive litigation. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and walked toward the center of the floor, projecting an aura of deeply manufactured sympathy. He did not look at me or Harrison. He looked directly at the judge, ready to execute a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "Your Honor, we are not here today to debate the tragedy of the Kensington kidnapping," Gibson began, his voice dripping with faux compassion. "We are here to address a simple, undeniable matter of contract law. My clients, Richard and Patricia, are currently being painted as villains in the media, but the truth is, they are victims of a deeply troubled, incredibly unstable young woman who is now using her sudden, unearned wealth to destroy the only family that ever cared for her." Harrison shifted beside me, his entire body going rigid with suppressed fury. Attorney Reynolds, our lead counsel, immediately stood up to object, but Judge Mitchell waved him down, instructing Gibson to keep his opening statement to the facts of the injunction. "The facts are exactly what I intend to present," Gibson said smoothly. He walked back to his table and picked up a manila folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it on the overhead projector. The massive screens in the courtroom illuminated with a document that made my stomach churn. It was the Medicaid application I had filled out just 72 hours ago. This is an application for state-subsidized health care filed by the defendant just 3 days ago, Gibson announced, pointing a laser pointer at my listed income. For the past 15 years, Hazel has been entirely incapable of maintaining financial stability. She has bounced between low-paying jobs, struggled with severe mental health issues, and has repeatedly proven herself completely incapable of functioning as a responsible adult. She is a college dropout with a documented history of erratic, delusional behavior. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of ice. Gibson was weaponizing my lowest moment. He was taking the poverty Richard and Patricia had forced on me and using it to portray me as unstable and incompetent. It was the same gaslighting Patricia had used throughout my childhood, now amplified inside a state courtroom and wrapped in formal legal language. My clients knew about her severe instability. Gibson continued pacing in front of the judge. They knew she was a flight risk. They knew she was prone to making destructive decisions. That is exactly why they drafted the asset relinquishment contract when she turned 18. They wanted to protect her from herself. They offered to pay for her college tuition to give her a future, but in exchange, they required her to sign over any future financial windfalls to ensure she would not squander her life. It was an act of parental protection. Objection, Attorney Reynolds barked, standing up. Opposing counsel is testifying to the emotional state of his clients and making unsubstantiated claims about my client's mental health to distract from the fact that this document was obtained under extreme duress. Sustained, Judge Mitchell said dryly. Mr. Gibson, stick to the contract itself. Gibson smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eye. Gladly, Your Honor. He signaled to his paralegal, who handed a plastic evidence sleeve to the court bailiff. The bailiff walked it up to the judge's bench. Inside the sleeve was the original paper contract I had signed 17 years ago. Your Honor, that is the original physical document, Gibson stated, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. As you can see, the final page bears the defendant's signature. We had an independent court-certified handwriting analyst examine the ink this morning. The analyst confirmed with 100% certainty that the signature is an exact, flawless match to Hazel's handwriting. She signed that document voluntarily as a legal adult. Judge Mitchell put on his reading glasses and scrutinized the document. The courtroom fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. I glanced over my shoulder at the gallery. Brittany was sitting in the second row, clutching her designer handbag. When our eyes met, she gave me a vicious, mocking smile. She thought she had won. She thought the trap had snapped shut. Attorney Reynolds stood up, his tone urgent. Your Honor, my client was 18 years old and completely financially dependent on her abusers. They presented her with the signature page of a student loan document and concealed the rest of the contract. This is a textbook case of fraudulent inducement. Judge Mitchell looked over his glasses at Reynolds. Counselor, while the circumstances surrounding the defendant's childhood are undeniably tragic and currently the subject of a federal criminal investigation, the law of equity in contracts is rigid. The signature is verified. Unless you have physical, irrefutable proof that the pages preceding the signature were altered or concealed, a verbal claim of duress made 17 years after the fact is exceptionally difficult to prove. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. The judge was right. It was my word against theirs. They had a physical document with my verified signature on it, and I only had the memory of Richard's hand covering the pages on a cheap kitchen table. Gibson seized the moment, stepping forward for the final blow. Your Honor, the defense has absolutely no physical proof of fraud because no fraud occurred. This contract is ironclad. My clients are legally entitled to all of Hazel's future assets. We ask that the court uphold the temporary injunction, freeze the transfer of the Kensington estate funds, and immediately redirect the disputed capital into my client's holding accounts until a final settlement is reached. Brittany shifted in her seat, her eyes shining with greedy anticipation. She was already mentally spending my inheritance. She was already planning how she would use my true father's wealth to bail her parents out of federal custody and restore her luxury lifestyle. They had cornered me perfectly. They had used the legal system to validate decades of emotional abuse, painting me as a crazy, ungrateful burden who needed to be controlled. Harrison gripped the edge of the defendant's table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. I could feel the immense power and rage rolling off him. He was a billionaire, used to crushing his opponents, but in this room, his money could not overwrite a verified signature. Judge Mitchell sighed, tapping his pen against the sounding block. He looked down at the contract, then over at me. "Ms. Kensington," he said, his tone carrying a trace of genuine sympathy, "I am deeply aware of the federal charges pending against your adoptive parents. However, probate law operates on the physical evidence presented. You signed this document. Unless your counsel can provide immediate physical evidence that invalidates the integrity of this specific contract, I have no legal choice but to uphold the injunction and freeze the assets." Attorney Reynolds leaned toward me, his face pale with concern. "Hazel, we might have to file an appeal. We need time to bring in forensic experts." I did not answer him. I did not look at Harrison. I looked directly at the plastic evidence sleeve sitting on the judge's bench. For my entire life, Richard and Patricia had told me I was useless. They had mocked my passion for art history and restoration. They had thrown me into the snow because they thought my chosen path in life was a pathetic joke. They had completely overlooked the fact that the career they despised had turned me into one of the most lethal document analysts in the country. I stood up from the defendant's table. The sudden movement drew the attention of every single person in the room. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence with crystal-clear precision. Opposing counsel stated that a handwriting expert verified the ink of my signature. But did they verify the ink of the printed text? Gibson frowned, stepping forward. "Your Honor, the defendant is grasping at straws." I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on the judge. "I am a certified archival document restoration specialist," I continued, stepping out from behind the table. "I request the court's permission to approach the bench and visually examine the original document under the light of the projector. I believe I can provide the physical, irrefutable proof of fraud the court requires, right here, right now." Judge Mitchell stared at me for a long, calculating moment. He looked at Gibson, who was practically vibrating with indignation, and then back to me. "Proceed, Miss Kensington," the judge said, gesturing toward the bench. Gibson immediately threw his hands in the air. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant is not an objective expert witness. She has a clear conflict of interest." "She is not testifying as an expert, Mr. Gibson," Judge Mitchell replied sharply. "She is offering to point out a physical anomaly on a piece of evidence submitted to this court. If what she claims is visible to the naked eye under a standard projector light, then I want to see it. If she is wasting the court's time, I will hold her in contempt. Step forward, Miss Kensington." I walked past Gibson. I could smell the sharp, expensive cologne he wore, masking the sudden sweat of panic. I approached the clerk's desk and carefully slid the original contract out of its plastic evidence sleeve. The paper felt familiar in my hands. It was standard legal stock, slightly yellowed at the edges. I carried the document to the overhead projector. The bright, high-intensity bulb illuminated the pages brilliantly on the massive screens across the courtroom. I adjusted the focus until the text was razor-sharp. "Your Honor," I began, turning to address the bench. "When an individual signs a document with a standard ballpoint pen, the metal ball scores the paper. The ink flows into the microscopic trench created by the pressure bonding with the paper fibers. Over the course of 17 years, that ink undergoes a chemical aging process. It oxidizes. It settles deeper into the page." I flipped to the final page of the contract, placing my signature directly under the intense light. "As you can see, the ink of my signature has oxidized perfectly. The edges of the blue lines are slightly feathered, indicating natural aging. I will never deny that this is my signature. I signed this page exactly 17 years ago. I then placed the first page of the contract onto the projector glass. This page contains the core of the asset relinquishment clauses. I want the court to look very closely at the black printed text. I zoomed the projector lens in as far as it would go, magnifying the black letters until they were massive on the courtroom screens. If these pages had been assembled 17 years ago, their materials would age together, I explained. Instead, the first 4 pages and the signature page came from 2 different manufacturing periods. Before the hearing, I had asked Attorney Reynolds to bring a portable ultraviolet examination lamp and a calibrated archival loupe from my former laboratory kit. With the court's permission, the clerk dimmed the projector, and I passed the ultraviolet beam over the first page. A constellation of tiny yellow tracking dots appeared around the black text. These dots are machine identification marks produced by a modern color laser multifunction printer, I said. They encode the printer's serial pattern and the date sequence used when the page was created. They do not appear on ordinary photocopies, and they were not generated by the equipment Richard claimed was used 17 years ago. I moved the lamp to the signature page. The yellow pattern disappeared. The paper itself reacted differently as well. The first page glowed bright blue because it contained a newer, optical brightening compound. The signature page remained dull cream, consistent with the legal stock used when I was 18. I placed both sheets beneath the archival loupe and directed the camera toward their upper margins. The front pages also carry a manufacturer's micro watermark in the fiber, I continued. The batch code identifies paper produced within the last 4 years. The final page contains no such mark. The reporters stopped typing. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, studying the enlarged image. I shifted the camera to the upper left corner. 2 separate staple patterns became visible. The older holes on the signature page were wider and oxidized at the edges. The holes through the new pages were clean, narrow, and offset by several millimeters. This signature page was removed from the student loan packet I signed 17 years ago, I said. The new asset transfer pages were printed recently, placed in front of it, and attached with a different staple. The age of my signature is genuine. The contract surrounding it is not. Attorney Gibson rose quickly. Your Honor, she is offering an interested party's interpretation, not a certified laboratory conclusion. I agree that the document must receive independent laboratory testing, I said. I am not asking the court to accept my conclusion without verification. I am showing visible physical inconsistencies that make continued reliance on this document unsafe. The tracking pattern paper fluorescence batch watermark and mismatched staple holes can all be photographed, preserved, and tested. I carried the pages to the clerk rather than touching the judge's bench. Judge Mitchell examined the ultraviolet photographs on the courtroom monitor, then compared the 2 sheets beneath the lamp. Her expression hardened. The document no longer looked like an old contract with one disputed story behind it. It looked like what it was, an old signature page attached to recently manufactured evidence. Judge Mitchell placed the document carefully on an evidence pad and studied the ultraviolet photographs for a long moment. When she looked up, her expression had hardened into judicial fury. She lifted her gaze toward Gibson, and the silence in the courtroom tightened around the unmistakable anger in her expression. Mr. Gibson, Judge Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. You stood in my courtroom and presented this document as ironclad, verified evidence. You attempted to use the authority of this court to freeze the assets of a major estate based on a piece of paper that was clearly manufactured with modern printing technology. Gibson visibly recoiled. He looked at the document, then back to the judge, his slick confidence entirely shattered. Your Honor, I assure you I had no knowledge, My clients provided me with this document. I acted in good faith based on their representations. Your good faith is irrelevant right now, Judge Mitchell snapped. This court does not take kindly to being weaponized for extortion. The judge picked up his gavel. The temporary injunction is lifted immediately, Judge Mitchell ordered, striking the block with a resounding crack. The asset freeze on the Kensington estate is dissolved. Furthermore, I am directing the court clerk to impound this document. It will be turned over directly to the federal prosecutor's office to be added to the pending criminal charges against Richard and Patricia. If they manufactured this forgery, they will face federal perjury and fraud charges on top of everything else. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. The reporters scrambled for the doors, practically sprinting to break the news that the kidnappers had just been caught committing blatant, undeniable fraud in front of a federal judge. I turned around to face the gallery. Brittany was standing up, her hands trembling violently. The designer handbag she was clutching dropped to the floor, the heavy clasp echoing loudly over the commotion. The smug, vicious smile was completely gone. In its place was sheer, unadulterated terror. She realized exactly what had just happened. Her parents were not just going to lose the civil case. They had just handed the federal government the exact evidence needed to lock them in a penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. Attorney Reynolds clapped a hand on my shoulder, letting out a breath he had clearly been holding for the last hour. That was the most brilliant destruction of opposing counsel I have ever witnessed, he murmured. Harrison stepped up beside me. He did not smile, but the pride radiating from him was palpable. You did not just beat them, Hazel, you annihilated them. I looked at the empty space where Gibson had been standing moments before, already having fled the courtroom to try and save his own legal license. The weapon they had tried to use to enslave my future had been turned into the instrument of their ultimate destruction. I had taken the very career they mocked and used it to secure my billion-dollar legacy. Let us go home, I said to my father. We have a welcome party to prepare for. The welcome gala at the Kensington estate was an exhibition of absolute, untouchable power. Exactly 1 week after the Superior Court victory, Harrison opened the heavy iron gates of our main compound to the highest echelon of American society. Governors, tech billionaires, and media tycoons filled the grand ballroom. The vaulted ceilings glittered with crystal chandeliers, casting a brilliant light over a crowd that controlled the national economy. I stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, wearing a custom emerald silk gown. I was no longer the discarded, unemployed woman terrified of an eviction notice. I was the restored heir to a dynasty, and tonight was my official introduction to the world. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly in the background. Harrison stood beside me, introducing me to senators and corporate board members. They looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and intense curiosity. I held my ground perfectly, speaking with the refined grace and sharp intellect I had honed over 15 years of painstaking archival work. I belonged here, but a rat will always try to find its way onto a sinking ship, or, in this case, a floating palace. About 2 hours into the reception, a sudden, jarring commotion erupted near the entrance of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors were shoved open. The security detail moved instantly, but before they could physically tackle the intruder, a woman burst through the crowd of dignitaries. It was Brittany. She had likely used the last remnants of her rapidly evaporating social capital, or perhaps bribed a catering staff member to slip past the outer perimeter. Her appearance was a stark contrast to the immaculate elegance of the room. She was wearing a cocktail dress that was a season too old. Her hair was frantic, and her makeup was intentionally smudged to mimic deep distress. She threw herself into the absolute center of the ballroom, crashing to her knees on the polished marble floor directly at the bottom of the grand staircase where I stood. "Hazel, please!" Brittany wailed, her voice cracking with theatrical agony. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The lively chatter of hundreds of elite guests died instantly. The most powerful people in the country stepped back, forming a wide, uncomfortable circle around the sobbing woman on the floor. "Please, you have to stop this," Brittany sobbed, burying her face in her hands and shaking violently. "Do not be so cruel to our parents. They are elderly. They are terrified. They raised you. They kept a roof over your head when you had nothing. You cannot let the federal government lock them in prison and leave me completely destitute. Have some mercy on your family." It was a calculated, desperate performance. She knew she had no legal leverage left. Her only remaining weapon was public shame. By throwing herself at my feet in front of the American elite, she was trying to trap me. She wanted to force me into a corner where I would look like a ruthless, heartless tyrant, crushing a poor, desperate, loving family. She expected me to panic, to rush down the stairs and quietly offer her a check just to avoid a public scandal. She vastly underestimated me. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush down the stairs to comfort her. I looked down at her from my elevated position, my face an absolute mask of ice. The senators and billionaires in the room watched me closely, waiting to see how the Kensington heir handled a crisis. I took a slow, deliberate step down the marble staircase. The sharp click of my heel echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. "Mercy." I repeated my voice, projecting crisp and clear, carrying effortlessly across the massive room. "You broke into my father's house, interrupted a private gathering, and threw yourself onto the floor to demand mercy." Brittany looked up, her eyes wide, squeezing out another fresh tear. "We are your family, Hazel. You are destroying us over a misunderstanding. Please, just give us our lives back." I stopped on the bottom step, looking directly into her frantic eyes. "You demand mercy for the people who built your entire luxury lifestyle on top of my stolen childhood," I said softly, yet loud enough for the front row of guests to hear every syllable. Brittany reached out, trying to grab the hem of my emerald gown to amplify her victimhood. "Hazel, I am begging you." I stepped back, entirely out of her reach. I looked up toward the sound engineering booth on the second-floor balcony. I raised my right hand, caught the eye of the chief of security, and calmly snapped my fingers. The state-of-the-art acoustic system in the ballroom, usually reserved for symphonies, clicked loudly. A harsh digitized hiss of a restored analog tape flooded the room. The sound was abrasive, cutting through the refined atmosphere like a jagged knife. Then, a voice echoed from every speaker. It was Richard's voice. He was 35 years younger, but the arrogant, nasty cadence was unmistakably his. "Listen to me very carefully, Kensington," the recorded voice sneered, dripping with malice. "I have your daughter. You dropped the $2 million in unmarked, non-sequential bills exactly where I told you. If I see a single police cruiser, if you delay by even 1 minute, you will never see this baby again. Do not test me. Her life means absolutely nothing to me." A chilling sound followed the threat. It was the sound of an infant crying in the background. My crying. The recording clicked off. The heavy, suffocating silence returned, but the atmosphere in the room had violently shifted. The fake tears on Brittany's face dried instantly. Her mouth fell open in sheer, unadulterated horror. The realization of what had just played hit her like a freight train. She looked around the room expecting to see pity. Instead, she saw absolute revulsion. The billionaires, the politicians, the media tycoons, all stared at her with pure disgust. The elite society she had desperately tried to cling to was looking at her as if she were a toxic, contagious disease. A prominent governor in the front row actually took a physical step backward, shaking his head in repulsion. That was the official FBI wiretap recording from 1991, I announced, my voice slicing through the stunned quiet. That was your father, Brittany, threatening to murder an infant for $2 million. The exact same $2 million that paid for your private schools, your designer clothes, your luxury apartment, and the very shoes you are wearing right now. Brittany scrambled backward on the marble floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She tried to formulate an excuse, tried to speak, but her throat was completely paralyzed by the catastrophic humiliation. You came into my home to put on a show for high society, I said, looking down at her trembling form. You wanted them to see the truth about our family. Now they have heard it. I turned my gaze to the elite crowd gathered around us. Every single guest in that room understood the assignment. With a synchronized, devastating precision, the titans of American industry turned their backs on her. Entire groups of socialites and politicians pivoted away, raising their champagne flutes and resuming their quiet conversations, rendering Brittany entirely invisible. It was the ultimate social execution. She was no longer a person to them. She was a ghost. Harrison signaled the security team. 4 burly guards in black suits stepped out from the shadows. They did not treat her gently. They hauled Brittany off the marble floor by her arms, dragging her toward the heavy oak doors. She did not kick or scream. The absolute rejection from the society she worshipped had completely broken her spirit. As they dragged her past the staircase, I leaned in slightly, delivering the final, fatal blow to her delusion. "Do not ever speak to me about mercy again," I whispered. "Welcome to the real world." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her out in the cold night. I turned back to the gala, took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and smiled at my father. The perfect facade of my abusers was not just cracked, it was pulverized into dust. The morning after the gala, the hangover from my abusers was absolute. While the media relentlessly replayed the audio recording of Richard's extortion, I was back in the subterranean command center of the Kensington estate. I sat beside Caldwell watching the digital monitors. The public destruction of their reputation had been swift and merciless, but humiliation was not a federal sentence. I wanted them locked in a concrete cell, and to achieve that, I needed to exploit their fatal flaw. Their uncontrollable parasitic greed. Brittany was officially broke. The federal freeze on her parents' assets had trickled down, locking her trust fund entirely. But a lifetime of unbridled consumption is a disease. You cannot simply turn off 30 years of elite entitlement. Her luxury apartment management had posted an immediate eviction notice. Her leased sports car was slated for repossession. She needed cash immediately to keep up the illusion she was still royalty. I knew exactly how Brittany's mind worked. She considered me stupid. She still viewed me as the helpless teenager scrubbing her bathroom floors. She assumed that my transition into the Kensington Empire was purely a matter of inheriting a name, forgetting entirely that I possessed 15 years of meticulous technical expertise. I knew how to secure documents, and more importantly, I knew how to leave a digital door unlocked so a thief would walk right in. I instructed Caldwell to preserve one narrow financial opening, but we did not create it recklessly. The dormant regional account tied to my false identity had already been flagged by the bank's fraud division. Before a single dollar moved, the bank's general counsel, Agent Miller, and a federal cybercrime prosecutor approved a monitored recovery protocol. The account would remain visible through the old online profile because the profile itself was evidence. Any legitimate transfer request from me required direct verification through the Kensington legal office. Any attempt using the dead child's social security number, my forged birth certificate, or my obsolete driver's license would be isolated, mirrored, and recorded. The bank placed $150,000 into a controlled evidentiary balance. It looked available to anyone who entered the old portal, but an outgoing transfer could travel only into a quarantine account supervised by the bank and the federal government. The system would preserve the routing instructions, device information, identity documents, and intent of the person initiating the transaction without allowing the money to disappear. No one contacted Brittany. No one sent her a password or asked her to steal. We simply preserved the account she already knew existed and waited to see whether she would attempt to use information she had no legal right to possess. Brittany had lived in the same house as me. She knew the false Social Security number Richard and Patricia forced me to use. She knew my former addresses, my birth date, and the basic answers they had built into my identity profile. More importantly, investigators suspected that she still possessed copies of the forged records taken from my room years earlier. For 3 nights, the monitoring screen remained dark. On the 4th night, at exactly 2:13 in the morning, a yellow alert appeared across Caldwell's primary monitor. Unauthorized login attempt, he said. The connection originated from the Starlight Motel near Interstate 95. The device was a personal laptop, registered through a prepaid wireless account. A camera outside the motel office had already confirmed that Brittany checked into room 12 that afternoon. I stood behind Caldwell's chair while the bank's mirrored system captured each step. The intruder entered the old Social Security number, then came the false birth date, Patricia's maiden name, and the street where I had supposedly lived as a child. None of those answers belonged to the real Hazel Kensington. They belonged to the identity Richard created. The portal opened. The controlled balance appeared on the screen. $150,000. Brittany remained inside the account for nearly 4 minutes without touching anything. I imagined her staring at the number, measuring it against unpaid hotel bills, repossessed vehicles, and the luxury life slipping out of reach. Then the cursor moved. "She is creating a new recipient," Caldwell said. The recipient was a Delaware limited liability company formed 3 days earlier. Its registered agent led to an online incorporation service, but the receiving instructions ultimately pointed to a prepaid business debit account opened with Brittany's telephone number. She entered a transfer amount of $145,000. The number itself did not create the federal crime. The interstate electronic transmission, unauthorized access, stolen identity records, and deliberate attempt to move money that did not belong to her created the evidence. The amount simply proved how completely greed had overcome caution. The bank portal requested enhanced identity verification. Brittany uploaded 2 files. The first was a scan of my old driver's license. The second was the forged birth certificate Agent Miller had shown me at the beginning of the investigation. Caldwell enlarged the metadata panel. The image files had been created on a scanner located inside Richard and Patricia's house before the federal asset freeze. A third file followed a handwritten authorization letter bearing a copied version of my former signature. "She is not improvising," Caldwell said. Someone prepared a complete identity package. A message window opened on the mirrored device feed. Brittany had left a private chat application running in the background. The bank's fraud team could not read unrelated conversations, but a notification appeared across the screen while she worked. "Use the old documents from the study. Move everything before they lock that account too." The sender was saved as Mom. Caldwell captured the visible notification and forwarded it to Agent Miller for inclusion in the warrant affidavit. Brittany clicked Submit. The bank displayed a confirmation page telling her the wire had been accepted for processing. From her perspective, the money was moving into the Delaware company. In reality, the funds entered the quarantined evidence account and could not be withdrawn. A solid green banner appeared across the monitor. "Transfer authorized, under federal review." Caldwell removed his glasses. She completed the instruction, uploaded forged identification, and supplied an interstate destination. The bank has preserved the entire session. I called Agent Miller on the encrypted line. He answered immediately. "The transfer is complete," I said. "Room 12 at the Starlight Motel. We have the device address, the Delaware routing instructions, the identity uploads, and a visible message directing her to use documents taken from Richard and Patricia's study." "We received the bank packet," Agent Miller replied. "A cybercrime team is moving to the motel now. A second team is executing the kidnapping and financial warrants at the house. The new evidence supports seizure of their devices and the remaining identity files." I looked at the map. 2 separate markers began moving, one toward Brittany, one toward the people who had created the false identity she had just used. "Will the transfer money be lost?" I asked. "No. It never left the controlled account. The bank protected the funds while preserving the completed electronic instruction and every act she took to obtain them. That distinction mattered. I had not sacrificed $145,000 to punish her. I had preserved an opportunity for Brittany to make her own choice under observation. She chose theft. A live security feed from the motel appeared on a secondary monitor. Federal agents approached room 12 without sirens. At the same moment, the map showed the tactical warrant team turning into Richard and Patricia's neighborhood. I watched Brittany's motel door open. An agent identified himself and ordered her away from the laptop. The screen went dark as the device was seized, but not before the final confirmation page remained visible in the browser. Agent Miller's voice returned through my phone. "Brittany is in custody. The laptop forged identification files and prepaid account records are secured. She will be processed separately on identity theft and wire fraud charges." I ended the call. The trap had not depended on a magical dollar threshold or an unsecured bank. It had depended on documentation patience and Brittany's certainty that anything connected to me was hers to take. I left the command center and found Harrison waiting near the front entrance. A black, armored SUV idled in the driveway. "The motel team has her," I told him. "The house team is moving now." Harrison opened the rear door. I had spent 35 years living under crimes Richard and Patricia committed. Tonight, the false identity they built to control me had become the evidence that finally closed around all 3 of them. The drive took less than 40 minutes. We parked 2 blocks away from Richard and Patricia's sprawling mansion, holding our position in the shadows of a manicured cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was dead silent, the kind of absolute quiet that only exists in extremely wealthy gated communities where people believe their money insulates them from the harsh realities of the world. Through the tinted windshield, I watched the street. There were no sirens. There were no flashing lights. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not announce its arrival when executing a high-risk raid on flight-risk targets. 4 unmarked black vans rolled down the street in perfect, synchronized formation. They cut their headlights a block away, gliding to a halt directly in front of the manicured lawn I had spent my entire adolescence maintaining. The side doors of the vans slid open simultaneously. Over 24 federal agents poured out into the night. They moved with terrifying, absolute precision. They were wearing heavy tactical gear, Kevlar vests and helmets, carrying breaching tools and federal warrants. Harrison lowered the window slightly so we could hear the execution of the raid. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on the heavy mahogany front door of the mansion. The tactical team swarmed the porch. There was no polite knocking. A massive steel battering ram swung forward, striking the custom door with a concussive boom that shattered the stillness of the neighborhood. The reinforced wood splintered and gave way instantly. "FBI search and arrest warrant, get on the ground!" The shouted commands echoed out into the street. Beams of blinding tactical flashlights cut through the darkness of the house, sweeping across the vaulted ceilings and the expensive artwork Richard had purchased with my ransom money. I sat perfectly still in the SUV, watching the raid unfold with the clinical detachment of an archivist examining a neutralized threat. Inside the house, total chaos erupted. Through the shattered front entrance, I could hear the distinct sound of Richard shouting. He was trying to use his loud, aggressive alpha male voice, the same booming tone he had used to terrorize me for 16 years. He demanded to know who was invading his property, threatening to sue, threatening to call the chief of police, throwing his perceived status around like a shield. The federal agents did not care about his status. A loud scuffle ensued in the grand foyer. Richard had apparently tried to resist or aggressively approach one of the tactical agents. It was a fatal miscalculation. "Put your hands behind your back! Stop resisting!" The sickening thud of a body hitting the imported marble floor echoed out the front door. Richard's arrogant shouts instantly morphed into a pathetic, breathless groan as his face was pressed hard against the very floor he had once forced me to scrub with a toothbrush. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut signaled the absolute end of his reign. A moment later, Patricia's hysterical shrieks pierced the night air. She was being escorted down the grand staircase by 2 female agents. She was not wearing her carefully curated designer outfits or her flawless makeup. She was wearing a silk nightgown, her hair disheveled, her entire facade of upper-class elegance completely obliterated. She was sobbing wildly, attempting to execute the exact same manipulation tactics she had used her entire life. "You are making a mistake," Patricia cried out, her voice shrill and desperate as they marched her into the foyer to stand next to her restrained husband. "We are upstanding citizens. We are victims. Our daughter just set us up. She is a billionaire, and she is trying to frame us. Please, you have to listen to me." The agents ignored her theatrical tears entirely. They forced her into a standing position against the wall and secured her wrists behind her back. Agent Miller stepped through the shattered doorway, walking into the center of the foyer. The tactical flashlights illuminated his face as he stood before the 2 people who had ruined my childhood. He unrolled a thick stack of federal warrants. "Richard and Patricia," Agent Miller announced his voice, projecting with absolute, lethal authority. "You are both under arrest by order of the federal government. You are being charged with the interstate kidnapping of a minor, federal extortion, and the concealment of $2 million in stolen ransom funds." Patricia let out a guttural, horrified gasp. Her knees buckled, but the agents held her upright. Furthermore, Agent Miller continued, "You are charged with systematic welfare fraud spanning Hazel's childhood, tax evasion, identity falsification, and laundering the ransom proceeds. Your daughter Brittany was detained at the Starlight Motel on separate identity theft and wire fraud charges. Agents recovered Hazel's forged records from her laptop and messages directing her to use documents kept in your study. Those devices are now evidence in this investigation." Richard's head snapped up from the floor. The fight completely drained out of his body. The realization that their golden child had just been caught committing a massive federal felony was the final nail in their coffin. Their entire criminal network had collapsed in a single evening. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Miller recited the Miranda warning, sealing their fate. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The neighborhood was no longer asleep. The concussive breach of the door and the shouted commands had woken the entire cul-de-sac. Lights flicked on in the surrounding mansions. The wealthy neighbors, the country club elites, whom Patricia had spent decades trying to impress, were stepping out onto their porches and peering through their curtains. They were witnessing the absolute destruction of Richard and Patricia's reputation. "Bring them out," Agent Miller ordered. The federal agents hauled Richard up from the marble floor. They marched him out the front door and down the porch steps. He was barefoot, his face red and bruised from the takedown, his head hanging low to avoid the blinding tactical lights. He looked small, weak, and entirely pathetic. The formidable, terrifying monster of my childhood was nothing more than a cowardly thief in handcuffs. Patricia was dragged out right behind him. She saw the neighbors watching from across the street and tried to hide her face behind her shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. The ultimate socialite, was now doing a perp walk in her nightgown in front of everyone she had ever lied to. Harrison tapped his driver on the shoulder. "Pull forward," he commanded. The armored SUV rolled slowly down the street, stopping directly in front of the driveway, just as the agents were loading Richard and Patricia into the back of the transport vans. Harrison rolled down my window. The sound of the engine caught Patricia's attention. She looked up through her tears, her eyes locking onto the dark window of the SUV. She saw me, sitting in the back seat, dressed in immaculate, tailored clothes, flanked by the billionaire father she had tried to erase. Hazel Patricia shrieked, a desperate, animalistic sound escaping her throat. She struggled against the agents holding her. "Hazel, please, tell them it is a mistake. We kept you alive. We gave you a home. You owe us. Please do not let them do this to us. I did not roll the window up. I did not avert my gaze. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had stolen my life and abused me for decades." I leaned slightly toward the open window, ensuring my voice carried over the cold night air. "I gave you exactly what you earned, Patricia," I said, my voice echoing with icy, unshakable finality. "You told me I would end up with nothing, but it looks like you are the one who is going to die in a cage." Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute defeat. He finally realized that the girl he had thrown into the snow had returned as an avalanche. "Put them in the vehicle," Agent Miller commanded. The agents shoved Richard and Patricia into the back of the heavily armored federal transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, echoing with a resounding, permanent metallic clank. The lock engaged, sealing them inside a dark steel box. I watched the red and blue emergency lights reflect off the shattered front door of the mansion. The house that was built on my ransom money was now an active federal crime scene. It would be seized, liquidated, and erased from the map. The empire of lies was completely annihilated. I pressed the button to roll up the tinted window, shutting out the cold air and the flashing lights. I settled back into the plush leather seat of the SUV and looked at my father. "It is over," Harrison said quietly, placing a comforting hand over mine. I nodded, watching the federal transport vans pull away from the curb, carrying my abusers toward a miserable, inescapable future. The nightmare was officially dead. The restoration of my life had finally begun. The morning sun rose over the Kensington estate, casting long, golden shadows across the lawns. For the first time in 35 years, I woke without anxiety knotting my stomach. Richard and Patricia had been denied bail as extreme flight risks. Brittany had been booked separately at the motel her laptop and forged documents seized, then released after an initial appearance under strict pretrial conditions because her charges were nonviolent. She surrendered her passport, wore an electronic monitor, and was forbidden to access any account connected to my former identity. My father and I sat in the bright glass-walled breakfast room overlooking the ocean. We were quietly reviewing the legal filings with the estate attorneys when the chief of security walked in. His radio buzzed quietly on his lapel. "We have a situation at the main gate," the security chief announced, keeping his voice professional. "It is Brittany, the woman you were raised to believe was your sister. The police impounded her vehicle after the asset seizure, and she apparently walked the last 3 miles up the private road. She is demanding to speak with you and refuses to leave the perimeter." Harrison set his coffee cup down, his expression hardening into stone. "I will have the guards remove her for trespassing. She has absolutely no right to be anywhere near this property." I held up my hand, stopping my father before he could give the order. "No," I said, my voice completely level. "Let her through. Escort her to the front courtyard. I will speak to her." Harrison looked at me, clearly concerned that interacting with Brittany would bring unnecessary stress. But he saw the absolute resolve in my eyes. He nodded to the security chief, authorizing the entry. I stood up from the table and walked through the sprawling corridors of the estate toward the grand entrance. I stepped out onto the massive stone portico. The crisp morning air was sharp and invigorating. I stood at the top of the sweeping marble steps, looking down at the heavy iron gates as they swung open. Brittany stumbled into the courtyard, flanked by two towering security guards. The sight of her was jarring. The pristine, arrogant golden child had vanished completely. She was wearing yesterday's clothes, wrinkled and stained with dirt from her long walk. Her designer shoes were scuffed, and her hair was a tangled, frantic mess. The freezing of the accounts and the realization of her impending federal wire fraud charges had aged her 10 years overnight. When she saw me standing at the top of the stairs, wearing an immaculate tailored blouse and flanked by the absolute power of the Kensington Empire, her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the hard cobblestone of the courtyard. "Hazel!" she sobbed, her voice echoing wildly against the stone walls of the estate. "Hazel, please, you have to listen to me." I did not walk down the stairs. I stood perfectly still, looking down at her with the same clinical, detached observation I use to authenticate damaged manuscripts. "State your business, Brittany," I commanded my voice, projecting across the courtyard like cracking ice. She crawled forward, ignoring the rough stones scraping her bare knees. The security guards took a step forward, but I signaled them to hold their position. She reached the bottom step, throwing her hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. They denied the bail. Brittany wept, her face red and contorted with panic. The judge refused to let them out. "They are going to stay in federal prison until the trial. You have to pay the bond, Hazel. You are the only one with the money to convince the judge to grant them house arrest. Please, they are old. They cannot survive in a concrete cell." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer, staggering magnitude of her delusion. "You walked 3 miles to my father's house to ask me to post bail for the people who kidnapped me," I stated, laying out the absolute absurdity of her request. "You want me to use the Kensington fortune to rescue the criminals who stole it in the first place." Brittany shook her head frantically, fresh tears streaming down her face. "It is not just about them. It is about me. They seized my apartment, Hazel. The bank locked the doors this morning. The leasing office threw my things into garbage bags. My car is gone. My credit cards are declining every transaction. I have absolutely nothing." She wiped her nose with the back of her trembling hand, completely abandoning any shred of dignity. "The lawyers say I am going to be indicted for the wire transfer," she wailed, hyperventilating as the reality of her own crimes crashed down on her. "They say I need a private defense attorney, but I cannot afford one. You have to drop the charges. You have to give me an allowance, just $50,000 a month, just enough so I can find a safe place to live and hire a lawyer. I do not know how to work, Hazel. I do not know how to survive out there. I have never had a job. I will die on the streets." She pressed her forehead against the bottom marble step, completely prostrating herself before me. "I am begging you," she cried. "Show some compassion. We family." I took a slow, deliberate step down the stairs. Then another. I walked down the sweeping marble staircase until I was standing directly in front of her kneeling form. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, with a desperate, pathetic hope. She thought her tears would work. She thought the sight of her groveling would trigger some deeply buried sisterly affection. I leaned down, closing the distance between us, until my face was inches from hers. I looked directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. "Do you remember my 20th birthday?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. Brittany blinked, completely thrown off guard by the question. She shook her head, unable to speak. "I was living behind a diner, in a rusted car that did not run," I said, painting the picture with brutal precision. I had not eaten a real meal in 4 days. I was digging through the commercial dumpster in the freezing rain, looking for discarded bread crusts just to stop the pain in my stomach. You drove past that diner in the brand new luxury sedan Richard bought you for your birthday. You saw me standing in the garbage. You rolled down your tinted window, pointed at me, and you laughed. Brittany gasped, the color completely draining from her face. Hazel, I did not mean it. I was just a kid. I stood back up, towering over her shattered, trembling frame. You knew exactly what you were doing, I stated, delivering the final, devastating verdict. You thrived on my suffering. You built your entire identity on the fact that you were superior to the poor, broken girl your parents kept locked in the shadows. You never once offered me a single dollar, a single meal, or a single moment of kindness when you had all the power in the world. I turned my back on her and walked up the first few marble steps. Please! Brittany shrieked, reaching out and clawing at the empty air behind me. I do not know how to live like this. I do not know how to be poor. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. I gave her one last, razor-sharp smile. Welcome to the real world, I said softly. Figure it out. I walked to the top of the stairs and signaled the security team. Escort her off the property. If she returns, have the local police arrest her for criminal trespassing. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Kensington estate. I did not look back, as Brittany's hysterical screams echoed across the courtyard, swiftly cut off as the massive doors slammed shut behind me with a resounding, permanent thud. The thick wood completely silenced her cries, leaving me in the warm, absolute peace of my true home. The boundary was set in steel. The parasitic chapter of my life was officially closed. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but when they finally catch their target, they crush everything in their path. The criminal trial of Richard and Patricia began exactly 8 months after the FBI raid on their suburban fortress. During those months, the absolute isolation of federal holding cells had done what no amount of moral reasoning ever could. It broke their unified front. The arrogant solidarity they had maintained while abusing me for decades completely evaporated the moment they faced the reality of spending the rest of their natural lives behind bars. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom, flanked by Harrison and a team of private security. The gallery was packed with national journalists, legal analysts, and true crime reporters. The air in the room was highly pressurized, charged with the anticipation of a historic verdict. Richard and Patricia were escorted into the courtroom through a side door. They were wearing identical, faded orange jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy metal chains. The physical transformation was staggering. Richard had lost his intimidating, aggressive bulk. He looked hollowed out. His posture stooped under the weight of his impending doom. Patricia looked entirely unrecognizable without her designer clothes, her expensive cosmetics, and her carefully curated aura of superiority. Her hair was stark white at the roots, her face heavily lined with terror and exhaustion. They did not look at each other as they took their seats at the defense table. The federal prosecution team was merciless. They laid out the timeline of the 1991 kidnapping with surgical precision, backed by the recovered audio tapes, the laundered financial records, and the irrefutable DNA evidence. They painted a devastating portrait of an inside job orchestrated by a disgruntled security contractor who used a stolen infant to fund his ascent into the upper middle class. But the prosecution did not need to work hard to destroy the defense. Patricia did that for them. Facing a massive list of federal charges, Patricia activated her ultimate survival instinct. She turned into a state witness and formally testified against her own husband. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery when the prosecutor called her to the stand. I watched, with cold, analytical detachment, as Patricia raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. She adjusted the microphone, looking directly at the jury box, and began to systematically dismantle the man she had been married to for nearly 40 years. She wept on command, reverting to the exact same theatrical victimhood she had tried to use on me. She claimed she had no idea Richard was planning a kidnapping. She testified that he brought a baby into their apartment in the dead of night and threatened to kill her if she went to the police. She painted herself as a terrified, abused hostage who was forced to participate in the money laundering and the decades of deception out of pure survival instinct. She detailed exactly how Richard managed the offshore accounts, how he forged my medical records, and how he directed the welfare fraud scheme to hide their stolen wealth. The defense attorney immediately tried to break her during cross-examination. He pulled up credit card statements showing her exorbitant spending at luxury boutiques, asking if a terrified hostage typically bought imported designer handbags. Patricia fired back, screaming that spending the money was the only way to keep Richard happy and prevent him from turning his violence toward her. The courtroom turned into an absolute circus of bitter, desperate recriminations. Richard sat at the defense table, his face turning a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He suddenly lunged forward, his chained hands slamming against the heavy wooden table as he screamed obscenities at his wife. Federal marshals immediately tackled him, forcing him back into his chair as the judge threatened to have him gagged and removed from the courtroom. Patricia did not stop. She offered up every single detail the prosecution needed to secure a maximum sentence. She threw her husband entirely to the wolves, banking on the hope that her cooperation would buy her freedom. She thought her tears would work on the federal judge, just like they had worked on her country club friends. She was severely mistaken. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, Judge Alvarez demanded absolute silence in the courtroom before delivering the sentencing. He looked down from the high bench, his expression radiating absolute judicial disgust. Richard, as the mastermind of the kidnapping, extortion, and systemic financial fraud, received the maximum penalty allowed by federal guidelines. Judge Alvarez sentenced him to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. Because of his advanced age, it was effectively a death sentence. Richard did not react. He simply stared blankly at the floor as the marshals hauled him away. Then the judge turned his attention to Patricia. She stood up, her hands clasped together, leaning forward with an expression of desperate, pathetic hope. She genuinely believed her testimony had saved her. "You provided valuable insight into the mechanics of this criminal enterprise," Judge Alvarez stated, his voice ringing across the silent room. "However, your testimony also revealed a chilling, calculated cruelty. You were not a terrified hostage. You were a willing, active participant who enjoyed the spoils of a stolen fortune. You stood by while an innocent child was subjected to intense psychological abuse. You committed decades of welfare fraud to protect your stolen wealth, stealing resources meant for actual impoverished families. Your tears today are not born of remorse. They are born of the sudden realization that you have finally been caught." Patricia let out a sharp, horrified gasp, her knees beginning to buckle. "For your role in the conspiracy, the kidnapping, and the systemic financial fraud," Judge Alvarez pronounced, striking the gavel with absolute finality, "I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." Patricia screamed. It was a raw, visceral sound of pure terror. She reached out toward the judge, begging for mercy, pleading that she would not survive 15 years behind bars. Two female marshals grabbed her by the arms, dragging her out of the courtroom as she thrashed and sobbed. I sat perfectly still beside Harrison. There was no joy, no triumphant celebration. There was only the quiet, heavy realization that the universe had finally balanced the scales. The people who had stolen my life were now going to spend the rest of theirs locked in concrete cages. While her parents were shipped off to federal facilities, Brittany faced a vastly different but equally devastating reality. The federal prosecutor had offered her a strict plea deal regarding her attempt to commit wire fraud. To avoid joining her parents in prison, she accepted 10 years of federal probation and was ordered to pay massive restitution fees for the financial resources she had drained. Stripped of her stolen trust fund, her life unraveled with breathtaking speed. The management company of her luxury high-rise apartment formally executed her eviction. The building manager, whom Brittany had treated like a peasant for years, handed her 3 industrial garbage bags and gave her exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. The repo man arrived in the middle of the night to tow away her premium sports car, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on her back. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to the social execution she experienced. Brittany had spent her entire life cultivating a circle of elite, wealthy friends. She had used them to reinforce her own status, constantly mocking anyone who did not meet her financial standards. When the news of the Kensington kidnapping broke and the details of her own wire fraud attempt were made public, those friends vanished completely. She tried to call her closest confidants, begging for a place to sleep. Her numbers were blocked. She showed up at the exclusive country club she had frequented, demanding to speak to the manager, only to be turned away by security guards who had been explicitly instructed not to let her on the premises. In the span of a single month, Brittany went from a high society socialite to an absolute pariah. In their elite circles, poverty combined with a federal kidnapping scandal was the ultimate social poison. Desperation is a ruthless teacher. Without any higher education, devoid of any marketable skills, and carrying the heavy burden of a highly publicized federal probation record, Brittany had zero employment prospects in the corporate world. She was forced to take the only job that would hire her without a rigorous background check. Through the weekly updates provided by Harrison's security team, I learned exactly where the golden child had ended up. She was hired to work the graveyard shift at a decaying 24-hour diner located off a busy interstate highway. It was a brutal, grueling environment. The air was thick with the smell of stale grease and industrial bleach. She was forced to wear a cheap polyester uniform her days, consisting of scrubbing sticky vinyl booths, serving exhausted truck drivers, and cleaning heavily soiled restrooms. Her hands, which had never known a day of hard labor, became cracked and blistered from harsh chemical cleaners. Her feet swelled from standing on hard linoleum for 10 hours straight. Every time a demanding customer yelled at her for a cold cup of coffee, or threw a crumpled dollar bill on the table as a tip, she was forced to swallow her pride and clean up the mess. If she complained, the night manager would scream at her, threatening to fire her on the spot. It was a perfect poetic symmetry. The universe had placed her in the exact same environment she had once mocked me for enduring. The woman who had laughed at me while I dug through a commercial dumpster was now spending her nights hauling heavy bags of garbage out to the very same type of alleyway. I never drove to that diner to gloat. I never requested a photograph of her scrubbing the floors. I did not need to see her misery to feel validated. Knowing that she was forced to wake up every single day and face the crushing, exhausting reality of the working-class life she had so deeply despised was entirely sufficient. The parasitic chapter of my history was definitively closed. The abusers were caged, the golden child was humbled by poverty, and the Kensington name was finally, rightfully mine. I turned my attention away from their destruction and looked toward the horizon, ready to use my restored power to build an empire of my own. That future began with a calculated real estate transaction. 6 months after the federal sentencing, the final forfeiture judgment became effective. Because the mansion had been purchased with traceable ransom proceeds and maintained through laundered funds, the United States Marshals Service listed the property for a court-authorized public sale to satisfy restitution and executing every remaining claim held by Richard and Patricia. Developers circled the notorious estate, eager to demolish the crime scene and divide the valuable suburban land. They never stood a chance. I did not attend the sale in person. My attorneys created a blind holding company for the acquisition and completed every bidder verification requirement with the Marshals Service. When bidding opened, my representatives defeated the largest development firms by a decisive margin. The purchase price was wired from a separate Kensington account, while the recovered ransom proceeds remained reserved for restitution and victim programs. The federal court approved the transaction, and the deed transferred into my legal possession within 48 hours. I did not buy the house to live in it. I bought it to execute a public, permanent eradication. The morning of the delusion was crisp, cloudless, and bathed in bright, unyielding sunlight. I had my public relations team issue a formal press release the night before, inviting the exact same media syndicates that had covered my initial discovery and the subsequent criminal trial. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the street was lined with news vans, reporters, and local residents who had stepped out onto their manicured lawns to witness the spectacle. I arrived in a sleek black town car accompanied by Harrison. I stepped out onto the pavement wearing a sharp, tailored white suit, projecting an aura of absolute renewal and untouchable authority. I stood on the sidewalk, looking past the iron gates at the massive, imposing structure. It was the house where I had scrubbed marble floors until my hands bled. It was the house where I was starved, belittled, and treated as an unwanted pest. It was the house where I was violently thrown into the freezing snow. Now it was nothing but an empty shell waiting for my command. A fleet of heavy industrial demolition equipment idled in the driveway. Massive yellow excavators with heavy steel claws sat perfectly still, their diesel engines rumbling with a low, hungry vibration. The foreman of the demolition crew walked up to me, handing me a bright yellow hard hat and a two-way radio. He gave me a respectful nod, waiting for my authorization. I did not put the hard hat on. I simply took the radio, pressed the transmission button, and looked directly at the heavy oak front door of the mansion. "Tear it down!" I ordered, my voice echoing firmly over the radio frequency. "Tear all of it down!" The operators engaged the machinery. The massive steel claw of the primary excavator swung forward, crashing directly through the second-story window of what used to be Brittany's luxurious, oversized bedroom. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood ripped through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The crowd of reporters fell completely silent, their cameras rolling to capture every second of the destruction. I watched without a single ounce of nostalgia or regret. I watched the steel claw rip the roof off the grand living room, where Richard and Patricia used to entertain their elite, oblivious friends. I watched the walls cave in, sending massive plumes of drywall dust into the air. The grand staircase, the expensive chandeliers, the locked refrigerator, and the tiny, suffocating room at the end of the hall, where I had spent my nights crying. It was all pulverized into a mountain of twisted metal and crushed concrete. The demolition took less than 2 hours. When the dust finally began to settle, the imposing, terrifying fortress of my childhood was gone. There was nothing left but flat, raw earth. Harrison stepped up beside me, placing a proud, grounding hand on my shoulder. We stood together, looking at the empty space. The physical erasure of the trauma was profound, but I knew that simply destroying the past was not enough. To truly win, I had to build a future that would render their cruelty entirely powerless. I walked toward a podium that my team had set up on the edge of the property line, directly facing the bank of media cameras. The journalists leaned forward, microphones extended, desperate to catch my first public statement since the trial. For nearly 2 decades, the land behind me was used to harbor a stolen child. I began my voice carrying with absolute, unwavering clarity over the gentle morning breeze. It was built on extortion, funded by ransom money, and maintained through systemic abuse and fraud. Today, we have leveled that history to the ground. But we are not leaving this land empty. I gestured to an architectural easel standing next to the podium. An assistant pulled away a velvet drape, revealing a massive, highly detailed architectural rendering of a stunning modern campus composed of glass, steel, and vibrant green spaces. My entire professional life has been dedicated to the restoration of damaged, forgotten, and discarded things. I continued looking directly into the camera lenses. I spent years repairing historical documents, proving that no matter how badly something is torn, it can be put back together if you have the right tools, the right patience, and the right expertise. Starting today, I am applying that exact same philosophy to human lives. I pointed to the rendering. On this exact plot of land, my father and I are breaking ground on the Kensington Hope Center. This will be a state-of-the-art, fully funded facility dedicated entirely to the recovery, legal representation, and psychological rehabilitation of missing, exploited, and abused children. The reporters began frantically typing on their phones, recognizing the magnitude of the announcement. The Hope Center will employ the most ruthless forensic accountants to track down stolen funds and hidden abusers, I announced, outlining the absolute power of the new institution. We will provide elite, relentless legal teams to ensure that no child has to face their tormentors in court alone. We will offer world-class psychological care, housing, and educational scholarships to ensure that trauma does not dictate a child's future. The people who lived on this land tried to break my spirit, to fund their own vanity. I am using my spirit to ensure that people like them are hunted down, prosecuted, and stripped of their power. I stepped away from the podium and walked back to Harrison. He was smiling a rare, genuine expression of profound peace and overwhelming pride. He handed me a ceremonial silver shovel with the Kensington family crest engraved on the handle. Together, my father and I walked onto the freshly cleared dirt. The flashbulbs of 100 cameras erupted as we drove the silver spades into the soil, officially breaking ground on the new facility. The earth turned over easily, soft and ready for a new foundation. I stood up and leaned against the handle of the shovel. The morning sun broke through the remaining dust in the air, casting a warm, brilliant light over the property. The cold, suffocating shadow of Richard and Patricia was entirely gone, replaced by the boundless open sky. I took a deep, unrestricted breath. The air tasted incredibly clean. For the first time in 35 years, I was not hiding. I was not shrinking myself to fit into a space designed to suppress me. I was not carrying the burden of a stolen identity, a fabricated history, or the crushing weight of abusers who demanded my gratitude for their crimes. I looked at the blueprint of the Hope Center, then out at the horizon. I was a restorer of broken things, and I had successfully restored myself. I was wealthy, I was protected, and I was completely, fundamentally free. I smiled directly into the sunlight. My name was Hazel Kensington, and my real life had finally begun.